Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 6 of Life, the Complete Story. I'm a bit blurry right now. Hopefully my camera focuses. But today we're going to be talking about the two phyla, Rotifer and Tardigrada, tardigrades and rotifers, more commonly known. Of course, as soon as we start recording, it goes blurry.
Yeah, that's
But
okay. We'll
yeah,
just roll with it. So
I'll fix it.
that's Tyler. I'm Alex. We're two young aspiring biologists who have been studying the natural world for a lot of our lives. Something that we've always been interested in. So as we go forward, of course, as we start every episode, we start with a little bit of nature in the news. So this week we have a article coming from the nature.com website. Is from actually yesterday. So it's a very new, titled Australia's Great Barrier Reef is transforming from repeated coral bleaching. So that's actually, I think, the last episode or two episodes ago, we talked a little bit about bleaching as we were making our way through
Nigerians.
from through the Nidarians as we talked about coral. So this is actually a very relevant article to what we've been talking about. So Tyler, if you want to take it away.
Yeah, I'll start us off this article, but first I kind of want to reiterate what we said 2 weeks ago about what coral bleaching is.
Yes.
Because it's going to come up a lot in this article. So coral bleaching, Alex, if you'll explain that while I
Yeah.
get
So,
this article pulled
as we
up.
talked about last week, a lot of your corals, they have a symbiotic relationship, so kind of mutualistic between different algae as well as the coral polyps. So the algae lives within the coral polyps, like their little shell casings that we had talked about. That body protective case that they make on top of the coral structures on that outer layer where the live polyps are. And so that's what gives corals their color. When you see pictures of a coral reef and they're all the different bright colors, that's what gives the colors. Those algae that actually live within the coral. So coral bleaching, in response to different stresses, in a lot of cases, it's things like ocean acidification or extreme temperatures, pollution, things like that. The coral polyps will uh, eject that algae from their bodies. Now, as you said, since they live in a mutualistic relationship, the corals will feed off the algae. The algae uses the coral's waste as kind of to produce its different. Use it for its own processes, as well as the coral gives it a safe place to live because the corals have those stinging cells. When it ejects that algae, the coral no longer has food, and the algae no longer has that safe place to live. So it turns the coral white, loses that color because we said the algae is what gives it that color. It's just left with that calcium carbonate shell that the corals live in. It's that white color. Think of like chalk, um, kind of the same chemical compound, more or less. Um, so with that bleaching, the subtitle, as we saw, is when Tyler opened the article here for us. The coral reef is currently experiencing its worst mass bleaching event on record as warming waters from climate change are to blame. So this is a pretty significant thing. The fact that it's a mass bleaching event. If you scroll back up, Tyler, you can show the viewers those white structures. Those are the coral. You can see the ones that still have a color, but they are starting to lose the color on the edges. That is them going through that bleaching process. And so in this case, you can see there's a lot of those corals that no longer have color. That's that mass bleaching event. So Tyler, if you want to take us a little deeper into the article.
Right, so as we said, this is the Great Barrier Reef off the coast of Australia. So, one of the largest reefs in the world, if not the largest. I
I
believe
believe
it
it
is the
is the
largest.
largest. Yes.
There's an estimated 3,000 individual reef systems in the Great Barrier Reef that make up this large super reef. And of those 3,000-ish, they tested 1,080 smaller individual reefs, um, and found that about 3/4 of these reefs have some sort of bleaching, and 40% show higher or extreme bleaching. So that means that when it, so I'll go up to this picture again, and these ones here, like in this general area, my cursor's hovering over here, they're just partially bleached around the edges and stuff. So uh, they've kind of showing more stress resistance.
Yeah, like mild to moderate bleaching, as
Right.
opposed to the higher extreme bleaching you see
Yeah.
where the
Some
full
of these ones that
structure
are
is
deep,
totally
like
white.
a complete white.
Yeah.
Yes. Um, so this is the fifth mass bleaching event in the past 8 years on the Great Barrier Reef, and in the last 6 years, it's been an every other year occurrence.
And as we talked about, corals have a fairly long uh, generation time, so it takes them a while to recover. As the article says here from the one scientist, his last name Hughes. I scroll back up to see
Terry
marine
Hughes from
biologist Terry
James Cook
Hughes.
from
Yes,
James Cook University.
in Townsville, Australia. So a marine biologist said like it's not enough time for those corals to recover. As they finally get that algae back, they start producing again. Then that 1 year they get that 1 year of kind of good proper like at least okay production, and then they bleach again that next year, just basically one step forward, two steps back kind of thing.
Right, and coral bleaching isn't like a killer per se of the coral. The coral is still alive, but it's kind of like in an immunocompromised type situation.
Correct.
And now, analogically, like
And as that goes on, every other year, even thinks people who are immunocompromised, they it seems like they're sick all the time. And this, of course, since the corals aren't able to really grow properly, produce the things they need to survive, now they're super susceptible for other things that make it easy, that either different diseases or predators that like feed on the corals a little bit already. It's like parrotfish, I know, or a fish that eats coral. Usually they're not too bad, but in a case like this where the coral can't regrow after being eaten, that's a big problem.
right. So this coral bleaching in the article it says that it's analogous to a fire on land through a forest. Uh, the same marine biologist says, similar to trees, the forest fire, and doing secondary succession. The trees, yeah, coils of trees, they can recover, but a lot of things recover faster.
Yeah, so I said those seaweeds flourish while the corals degrade. So then they begin to kind of crowd out the corals or shade out the corals, make that algae when they do come back, make it more difficult for the corals to recover because the algae is not getting the sunlight that it needs to produce uh, its own the sugars and things that the corals need that use to eat to survive.
Right. And one last thing for the article, they said that they had kind of an alarm go off on the 18th of April. They announced that, so this is 2 days ago from when we're recording this episode of the podcast. Um, they had a recording from the 15th where the water temperature at the southern reef tips were 2.5 degrees Celsius higher than the summer peaks historically. So we're talking April temperatures.
Yeah, pretty significant. Yeah, so
Right.
in their case, being on the southern hemisphere, it's their fall now. Um, so they're still in that warmer beginning to cool off, but the fact that it's still that hot getting towards the middle end of their fall, or not, yeah, like middle of their fall. So for the northern hemisphere, think like October. I think would
Right.
be yeah, roughly October, like
Well, but when things
October.
are supposed to be cooling down, it's heating up.
Yeah, it's much yeah, and in the fact that it's higher than the summer peaks when it's kind of supposed to be that much hotter. It is even that much hotter when it's not supposed to be, causing even greater stress on those coral.
Right.
And so I think that that forest fire analogy is a pretty good analogy. Thinking of like those large trees, you don't get big towering like forest king size trees that like that grow right back right after a forest fire. It takes decades for
Right.
those big trees to come back. The ones that do die in the forest fire. So same idea. Those big coral bodies that have a lot of polyps on them, many of those die. It's going to take years, if not longer, for those structures and those polyps to repopulate, kind of grow back to that healthy level. And as if you get that next forest fire, and in this case bleaching, that forest fire, all those saplings that would become those big trees are then killed again. And it's a vicious cycle that
Right. We're
it's a
bleaching
downward
corals
spiral.
before the new polyps can really grab a hold.
Yeah. So
So
it's
we're
a
kind of stagnating populations
yeah,
as
it's
well.
a downward spiral is kind of what it is.
All right, that's going to conclude our nature in the news. I think we can agree that's one of our favorite segments that we do on this show, and we'll move
Mhm.
over into our lesson of today. This is, we're not splitting this one. The past couple of weeks we've done here's the big phylum, and then here are the smaller bits to it. This week we kind of lumped them together and did here's two phylum because they're very unique and very interesting phylum, but at the
They're
same
not
time
big.
they're very similar and they're very big. I did a lot of research this week for these two phylum,
Hmm.
and I did not realize how much of an overlap there is.
Yeah, there's a lot of similarities. So as we said at the beginning of the episode, we're going into Rotifera or Rotifera, however you like to pronounce it, the Rotifers, as well, and then Tardigrade, the Tardigrades. You may even what do they call them, water bears, I think is one of the colloquial names
Yes,
for them.
the water bear.
So two very small multicellular organisms, but very small, almost microscopic in a lot of cases, that live just about anywhere in the world, in freshwater environments. But in that similarity, because they're so small, they kind of have a similar kind of space in your uh, food tree, um, as well as kind of the habitat that they fill in. That niche is the word I'm looking for. That niche that they fill in, very similar because of their size and kind of how they function. So we'll start with Rotifera, the rotifers. Rotifera, rotifer comes from a Latin word meaning wheelbearer. So this is named after. They have the rotifers. They look similar to coral polyps, like the cnidarian polyps, where they have kind of, but they're a bit more tube shaped. And then at the top of that shape, they have two little like wheels of cilia, so small little hair-like structures that kind of spin, and that's how they feed and move. Um, and they spin really quickly, so they look like wheels as those cilia move, and that's where they get the name Rotifera. And as I said, yeah. So here in the picture here, you can see where at the top there's kind of little spindle shapes. Especially that bottom left one is a good idea. Those little cilia crowns that they call them, that as they spin and as the cilia move and spin, that it gives it that wheel motion that they're named for. So as I said, found in a lot of freshwater environments like lake streams, wet soil, even to the point where they can be found in mosses and lichens. So on land, in those kind of damp environments, especially mosses, they get that real low to like rocks, or on decaying vegetation matter, that those moist, kind of damp areas where you can find some sort of water to for them to survive in. But they can actually be found too on what is it, crustaceans and insect larvae. So even there's some that may be parasitic in a way, where they survive on the bodies of other aquatic organisms.
Imagine it this way, where it's if there is a surface that can hold water, there is probably a rotifer living there because they're tiny, they're micron big, so they can live in the tiniest film of water. So yeah,
Yeah, yeah, just
um,
yeah, they can create found in like kind of bizarre places.
they are softer bodied. Um, they're mostly just a squishy type mesoderm, epidermis type thing. No real hard bones. The hardest part of their body is their mouth region, which is in these same pictures Alex was referencing earlier,
Mm-hmm.
right where those cilia are that form that crown.
Yeah, the cilia direct the foodstuffs to that mouth part, so it's a little bit harder for it to kind of chew and digest food.
Right, and fossils are sparse due to only having jaws and due to their small size. So the oldest known fossils that we have found are from the Eocene epoch, which I'm blanking on time period wise.
The
A long time ago.
the Eocene is okay. That is part of the Cenozoic era, so
Hmm.
predates dinosaurs.
So
Or
Cambrian?
no, sorry, it's after. Sorry, it's after dinosaurs.
Oh, I see now.
Yeah,
Okay.
part of the Cenozoic era. Yeah, so not long after dinosaurs. It's like one epoch past dinosaurs. Or yeah. Um,
Oh, okay. So this is like
so
Ice Age time.
so 50, yeah, like 56 to 34 million years ago.
Gotcha. Understood.
So
Geologic time periods are
yeah,
not my
not
forte.
not as old as some of the other ones that we've talked about, but as we said, those softer bodies make it harder for fossils to survive that long, and just due to their size as well. Makes it a lot harder for us to find fossils of them. There's a very good chance that they've been around longer than that. But as we said, it's hard to find fossils of anything older.
Right. So, one thing that's unique about these rotifers that we haven't really gotten to is they have a complete, um, I don't want to say complete, but a full primitive digestive system. So they have a mouth, they have a stomach region that digests, and they have an anus to uh, get
Excrete.
rid of their waste,
Yeah.
excrete their waste.
Yeah.
Right.
So this is a little bit as the ones we've been talking about. Um, the past few phyla, a little bit simpler. That is either the same place, or they just kind of filtered everything through like some cells with the sponges, and it had like an in and an out, but those weren't like all the digestion happened within the cells. Or the Cnidarians, where it was the same orifice that did both functions. Now these are slightly more complicated. We actually have a developed like a tube per se, that actually is like they have an in and an out. It's not the same orifice now that
Yeah,
does
they
both
they follow
functions.
they follow the primitive a tube within a tube
Yes,
coelom pseudocoelom type thing.
yes.
Um,
So they actually do their body cavities are like they do have a bit of a mesoderm, which is so like there's another layer. So usually you think of your epiderm or epidermis and your endodermis. So your outer epi meaning outer, and then endo meaning in. So you think like the stomach, that stomach lining, um, that is your endoderm. That's like your innermost layer, and then your epiderm is that outermost layer. Now, and the structures they have in between those layers now are developing a bit of a um, another layer to protect those as well. So again, beginning to get slightly more complex as we make our way through the phylogenetic tree.
right. Um, Another thing that rotifers do kind of differently than anything else we talked about is they are able to uh, sexually reproduce and asexually reproduce. They can do both through parthenogenesis. So what that means is they can create daughter organisms from unfertilized eggs.
So this is different than what we talked about with the sponges and cnidarians, where it's budding, where it's like a nut, like a growth comes off of the original organism and then develops into its own organism. This is now its actual sexual cells that are developing independently of the parent.
Right. And they have two forms, like two different types of reproduction. One where it is just the parthenogenesis, the egg only turns into a daughter cell, and they have a secondary form where um, they have two eggs, one that becomes a fully fertilized female, and the unfertilized ones become degenerate males. That all they do is emerge from their egg, drop their sperm, and then keel off and die.
Yes.
And uh, they have nerves. These have like an actual nervous, semi-actual nervous system. They have an eye spot for movement, so they can see what's around them, and uh, they have some ganglia. I thought I read in here they have ganglia. I might have read a different article, but there is some type of nervous system that controls their movement as well.
And then as well going through, you can see there's a line there. It says the bodies. You saw they're kind of that tube shape. They can telescope, so they can lengthen and shorten. Um, and they actually have a cuticle covering. So there's another kind of part of that epidermis. There's a dedicated layer that's like a protective layer. So this puts them closer to um, more developed advanced species like the roundworms, which we're going to talk about at some
Next
point,
week,
um, a few weeks, I believe, because these are like the segmented worms.
no, nematodes
And
roundworms.
that is flatworms.
No, that's platyhelminthe.
You're correct. You're right. But then also arthropods, which are much more developed. Those are your insects, crustaceans. So much more developed organisms that have that little bit extra layer on top for protection. And then they have at the bottom like that little foot and toe, which helps them,
Cement.
yeah, like get on, like attached to things, as well as they can also be free floating.
Final final touch point for Rotifer for me. If you've seen anything else in this article that you'd care to explain, um, you can do so, Alex. But my last point is Rotifers in the class Bedelloids or Deloids exhibit cryptobiosis. So cryptobiosis is being able to cease or halt your biological um, functions in order to preserve your livelihood in cases of extreme or harsh environmental stimuli.
Yeah, so especially for things like this, think of the ones that live on those mosses and those lichens. There is a fairly decent chance that they will dry up at some point, especially if you get like a drought period where there's a lot of um, long periods of no rain. And when they dry up, you said these organisms live in those damp, wet environments. Well, if they dry up, they're not going to survive. So what they do is they go through this cryptobiosis process. They kind of shut everything down and they kind of shrink up and close up, and that allows them to retain what they have. And since they don't have their biological processes going, they don't need water because they're not producing or anything. They don't have processes occurring that require water to function. So, and they stay in the state. It's like a similar, like a very long term kind of hibernation in a way that they just kind of stop. But yeah, it's even more. I should say it's even more extreme than hibernation because they completely stop their processes. They don't just slow down. Like large animals, when people think hibernation, you think bears. Um, they just slow their processes way down, but they don't stop. In this case, they actually fully stop, which is something we'll also talk about with the tardigrades because they do this as well. Yeah, and then they've also been able to uh, revive rotifers and tardigrades that have been in this cryptobiosis for pretty extended periods of time. They gave them water and they came back to life, basically. So It's an interesting process that very few organisms do, but it's something that is incredibly useful for them as well. It's a very interesting process that they go through.
Right. Yeah, as Alex kind of alluded, you will see cryptobiosis come up again when we.
Yeah, like it'll come up again when we get into tardigrada, and then last thing, we said Rotifera as a phyla. They do break down into three classes. Mono, I'm gonna butcher these names.
Oh yeah, they're confusing.
Monogononta, Bedeloida, Deloideae, and then Sasonidae. I think I got those right. Close
Yeah,
enough.
close
Um,
enough.
so largest, of course, is the Monogononata. Um, about 1,500, 1,500 species, and then Deloideae 350, and then in Sisonidae there's only two species that we know of. Typically, and it says regarded as the most primitive of the three. So when we get into our phylogenetic tree, they would be broken off first, and then from that other, so their branch and then the other branch would split into the other two
Yeah, they're the
classes.
basal species of the clade.
Yes.
Okay, so without further ado, we will flip the script and go into our tardigrades. So
Yes.
interestingly enough, tardigrades, rotifers, and nematoda are very closely, yeah, very closely related to each other.
Yeah. So, like we said, the cuticle that we talked about with Rotifera is something that you also find in Tardigrada and Arthropoda. That protective outer layering that protects them. So that's why they're very close. We talked about some of those other biological processes. They're actually kind of like a sister in the tardigrades. Said like a sister phylum to Arthropoda. So pretty closely related, like we said, in a lot of cases. So this is something uh, that kind of allows us to see how life developed in various different ways down the phylogenetic tree. So tardigrada, it was first described in the 1770s. So one of not a super recent discovery, but uh, older than some of our other, like I think Rotifera is a little bit more recent discovery um, compared to tardigrada. I think just because the tardigrades are a little bit bigger than Rotifera, and
I
then
think that has to do with just us classifying Rotifera as in the kingdom Animalia. I think they used to be kind
okay,
of put in that category with the diatoms and stuff
yeah,
in
yeah,
in the
because
protozoans.
they were so small, they didn't really understand how they fit in
Right.
the phylogenetic tree. So, so far, about 1,380 species identified. Uh, I'm sure they're finding more. It's just because they're so small, trying to
Right.
describe those different species. But they can be found pretty much everywhere on the world, in the world. Um, Pretty much anywhere there's water, mostly freshwater species, but there may be a couple saltwater or brackish like water species. Um, that they have found, but primarily freshwater.
Yes.
But pretty much
The
they
article
can.
we're using from Science Direct,
Yes.
emerging modal systems in developmental biology, tardigrades. Uh, they live nearly everywhere on Earth, often overlooked because of their size, often less than a millimeter long and transparent. Some live in marine sediments. Most live in the water films and soil. Uh, and we've gotten our best like sample sizes from these clean biological substrates with water films, mosses, and lichens, and can be found with nematodes and rotifers.
Yeah. So they all kind of occupy a similar space in uh, the biological world. That kind of very small size, um, like wet environments. So there you go. Tyler has pulled up for our viewers a picture of a water bear. They're tardigrade. They have typically eight legs that on the end of them they have little hooks that they use to kind of walk and grab on to things. But they're not super complex, similar to the rotifers. They kind of just have their main body. They're a little bit more complex than rotifera, um, just because they actually start showing some more. We're going toward what could be almost considered like organs. Of course, with rotifers, they get to that tube within a tube. They actually have a developed digestive system where they eat, food enters, digest it in a stomach, and then excrete it on the other end. And a lot of them, you can see here, they feed on things like algae, where they have like small little piercing mouth parts that they're able to get the juices out of algae and other microscopic animals. And they actually have a muscular pharynx, so that or pharynx, depending on how you say it. So kind of that upper throat portion, like where you would, or as well, it could be sort of like part of the mouth when you think of like a human's mouth. Um, that allows them to actually create like a suction to uh, remove the cytoplasm, so that cellular fluid that's in those microscopic organisms and algae that they're actually able they eat. Um, they ingest that uh, fluid to get their nutrients.
Right. Um, so I'll go into a little bit of the anatomy, physiology of the tardigrade here. As Alex was saying, they have that pharynx, however you want to pronounce it. I'll use the colored diagrams as I go over what is where here. So this red area is going to be that pharynx. Um, the orange little line here is, I believe, part of the mouth that kind of pierces and opens up those cells that we were talking about, how Alex was describing their feeding habits. The blue portion at the very top of their head is their brain,
Yeah, so
or
this
what
is
would.
actually as well something they actually have like a somewhat developed nervous system.
Right,
So you're getting
right,
getting more complex.
correct. This large orange uh, area is going to be their stomach tube within a tube, a pseudocoelom type thing. Alex, would you like to go over what a coelom is versus a pseudocoelom?
So coelom, you think of like a true digestive system. So I'm trying to run this off the top of my head, so I apologize if I
Oh, you can find notes, but
mess
I'll
up.
keep talking
Yeah,
about this
yeah,
if you want to
yeah,
find
yeah.
notes.
Let me find some notes.
Cool. These light blue areas. This we'll focus on photo D here. They got that go along uh, the underbelly. It appears is going to be that central, kind of like they're not a spinal cord, but the equivalent of a spinal cord for a tardigrade. Um, that's where all their that's where all the ganglia is that control the movement of their legs. And all these little gray dots floating around are I'm not sure if they're the storage cells that float around in the mesoderm region of a tardigrade, or if they're the muscles.
Looks like storage cells is what it looks.
Looks like
So
storage cells.
those would be similar to how on especially like mammals, you see they have like fat deposits. That would be their version of that, where they use those to
Okay.
store uh, compounds, different structures that allow for long term energy storage. Is pretty much what that is.
Okay.
Yeah. So then I also found your coelom versus your pseudocoelom. We're looking at it here. If you give me a chance, real quick, I will share a picture. here shows because pictures like our when we get into flatworms, they just have this digestive cavity that exists within them. So you have your outer layer, so that your ectoderm or epidermis that we talked about. That is your outer. I apologize. This is small for those.
It'll be okay.
Yeah. So there's like you have the tube, but then you have it directing, contacting with your mesoderm, so that middle layer of like where your other organs are, and then that outer layer, your pseudocoelom. So these are like your round worms. There's a separation there, so that tube is actually its own structure within um, the body. So it's separated from the rest of the body cavity, um, making it so it's similar to how our digestive system is, which would be a coelomate. Um, this is your what would be like the colon or like the digestive tract actually now has its own protective layer of mesoderm. So it's a um, like a it is now has that double layer protection, and then of course it's anchored to the rest of the mesoderm. But there's still that space in between that gives it like a true. It becomes a true organ at that point. It's not just like um, part of the just the tube of the body. It is its own proper organ within the organism. So it's now so the pseudocoelomates, they have that tube. There's a separation. Um, so it's beginning to become an organ, but it's still just kind of like a tube of cells. It's not the tube of cells that would extract the nutrients out of the food that it eats, um, and then pass it off to the rest of the body. Um, it just has that one layer that does that, but the true coelom, that true digestive system, and now passes it to those other cells, which then distribute it through the rest of the body. And then when you don't, the acoelomate, as you see, the flatworms, they have that cavity, but it's kind of like just the tube is lined with those cells. Um, so
Right.
the diagram kind of gives it a better idea of what that difference is, just looking at it here, um, as opposed to, um,
Us describing it with
yeah,
words and you being confused as a viewer
yeah,
because
and
we're saying,
it's been a while
right,
since
this is
I've
something
dived
that
into it.
we
Yeah,
covered in our invertebrate zoology class early on in the semester because we talk
yeah,
about acoelomates and pseudocoelomates
yeah,
early on in the semester. So for you people that have no idea what we're talking about, maybe you're new to the biology field or what have you, we appreciate you being here nonetheless.
yeah,
But the diagrams definitely help a lot better than us spatting nonsense.
yeah.
And
So
we
yeah,
encourage you to be a video listener as well.
yeah. So to put it simply, this a pseudocoelomate, it has that too, but it's not. It's separated from the rest of the internal body tissue, but it doesn't have its own actual cavity that has like a protective membrane around that digestive tract. It just kind of floats in there as part of the rest of the organs. And then acoelomate, it's another tissue um, that's part of the rest of the tissues within the body.
Right.
Is the best way
Um,
to describe that?
yes. So moving on from our little sidebar about coelums,
Yes.
um, the tardigrades have their body cavity has that mesoderm of storage cells rather than uh, they're free moving cells. So it's kind of like those toys you get that have like it's like the fake ocean and it's like just a little plastic tube with like the water and sparkles in it. That's about a tardigrade to me
I mean, it's a good analogy. It kind of
because
because
everything
those.
inside of it, besides the midgut and the nerves and everything, is just a free floating cells. There is no other structure in it. There is no tissues.
Mhm.
That's just free floating storage cells, along with this crisscross of a muscular system that kind of forms this makeshift hydrostatic skeleton. And that kind of gives it some structure and rigidity to this otherwise free-flowing organism. And once again, they exhibit cryptobiosis, as we talked about, being able to, for the most part, shut down all biological processes to ensure survival in harsh conditions.
Yeah. And the tardigrades are even more intense than the rotifers are. Um, to the point, what would they say? The record for they found some tardigrades. It was 100 plus years, and they reintroduced water to them, and then they were able to revive them.
Yeah,
Like so, it's incredibly long amounts of times. And when now this is a process they have to go through. A living tardigrade, if you very quickly dried it out before it had a chance to go through this cryptobiosis process, um, it would kill it. But when they go into this process, they kind of pull their legs in and basically just become like a little,
pillow.
just like a little pillow, or just like they become just like a little mush ball almost. But they kind of harden that cuticle a little bit, and it allows them to survive many intense, extreme conditions, like extreme pressures, temperatures, even radiation. It
Right.
says they can survive extremes of radiation in a hydrated state as well, but especially in that they say that desiccated, that dried out state. Um,
But they have to kind of hype themselves up to go in the cryptobiosis. They can't
correct.
just flick a switch and pillow.
Yes. Yeah. It is a process that they go through, kind of to prepare themselves for that state.
Right. Okay. That's going to wrap up our speech on tardigrades, or the lesson here. That
Yeah.
concludes our lesson in general for the day
Yeah.
on rotifers and tardigrades.
Yeah.
We're going to wrap up the show with our normal finish, our amazing species, and our most wanted. I'll go ahead and start this week. I know I've been taking
Yeah.
the tail end. Um, I went deep into the archives today, and I found a endangered species who's actually extinct in the wild, but is doing a lot better than you'd think for something extinct in the wild. You good there, bud?
Yeah. I'm good.
Bugging out.
Yeah. Sorry, my contacts are drying up a little bit. That's all.
Right. So I have not discovered, but I have found for us today the Pere David's deer. I believe that's how you say it. It's got an accent on the e, so I'm kind of
Yeah.
not
I'm
sure
not
how to
sure.
pronounce it.
Yeah, scientific name: Elaphurus davidianus.
Right. They are extinct in the wild. Last assessed March 2016. Before that, they were found in China, uh, one in the marshy coastal areas, grasslands, wetlands, marine, and tidal is what the IUCN specifies. In case you didn't know, these is a cervid. It's a type of deer.
Yes.
Um,
They fall under the mammals.
Mammals,
Yeah.
cervidae,
Phylum.
ungulates.
Yeah. Phylum chordata. So.
Uh, yes, they were. It was published and released and assessed in March 2016. Uh, they were found in China. They have been reintroduced in some areas, um, but not much has been determined to be a high enough population that it is reintroduced completely. But they do have some monitoring schemes. A reintroduction has happened, but it's not enough to move the meter as I just said. And they do have some protected conservation sites. A lot less threats than a lot of the marine species we've been covering these past couple of weeks. Really, it's just human intervention, some housing in urban areas where they would have their habitat, and some harvesting of non-timber crops. So I'm assuming that's like farming,
Most likely, if I had to
uh,
guess.
as well as hunting.
Yeah. seem to
So,
be like hunting, and this is what happens with a lot of these larger mammals, especially these larger animals.
yeah.
Hunting plays a big role. They were pretty much hunted into that extinction. Reading on here, it said these deer were part of like a royal hunting garden during the King Dynasty of China, so the early 1600s to the early 1900s. They had a hunting ground, mostly wetland, where some of these deer were kept. But then at the end of the where am I looking at? In the 1900 during the Boxer Rebellion in China, uh, this hunting area was occupied by uh, some military troops, where they hunted the rest of the deer and ate them because they were looking for food. So this happens, especially these larger animals that they know are good for foodstuffs. They get hunted, especially when you get large groupings of people that need that food. So they wind up getting hunted.
Right. So I have a story to tell about this species
Oh,
because it's kind of interesting how we got them to where they're at today.
okay.
So, right. Long time ago, 1860s, this deer was already close to extinction. Uh, couple herds living around in China. Uh, the most viable herd lived in the Emperor of China's Imperial Hunting Park, which was basically a mecca for game animals, anything that the Emperor of China deemed as a cool pet to have, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and this was that fortress conservation of we need to protect this so nobody can see it except for the people who are working with it. Uh, Unfortunately, that leads to a type of like island rule. I'll get to island rule at a later time when we start to cover species that actually use the island rule. But basically, it's small population where all of the genetics in that population revolve around a couple breeding families. So the gene pool is tremendously
Small.
small compared to a larger population. Uh, and they're also under higher threat to predators and disease and other things like that. Not only just genetic lottery losing. And it was protected pretty well. And then along comes this missionary from France, Father Armand David, hence why we get this name. Pere is French for father, so this is Father David's deer.
Okay.
He is an avid conservationist or naturalist. Conservation wasn't exactly a coined term yet, so he's a
Yeah.
naturalist who hears about these deer that are basically extinct everywhere else except for in the Emperor's Garden, and he says, "I want to take them. I want to see them before they go away." Um, he got his chance, saw the herd of deer, and this deer is weird because it's kind of like the Chinese named it. Its Chinese name because it has like the head of a giraffe or something, the hoof of a deer, or the hoof of something else, the antlers of a deer, and the tail of something else. So it's kind of a mixed up bag. Uh, and he said, I want to take some with me, and I want to get my own population and have some type of diversity because he kind of understood as a naturalist that that's not good to have that population. Um, so he made his own little island rule in France, and then came World War One, and the herd survived. And then came World War Two, and he realized that the chance of survival at the island is a lot slimmer than if he were to distribute them to the zoos around. So they kind of made their way to European zoos. Now we'll flash forward to today, and we have roughly 6,000 in captivity and 600 reintroduced into the wild. Uh, that is the end of my story, my little tangent
Yeah.
on the Prairie David's deer.
So slowly being reintroduced, not a ton that are like in the wild, but they are being uh, gradually reintroduced into the wild, becoming more prevalent. And he said now you get 6,000 captive individuals and 600 wild individuals. So as they're able to continue breeding, um, since they survived that genetic bottleneck, that island rule that Tyler called it, um, from that kind of fairly heavy inbreeding, they're now able. They've got enough individuals. They're able to diversify a little bit more genetically as they get more individuals that aren't quite so closely related, make them more viable. They can have a better chance of survival as they go forward. So that's something that can definitely look forward to as we continue to go forward um, with the conservation efforts for the species. So that's pretty cool. Kind of a quite a comeback story for sure.
So that's going to conclude my little discussion as an amazing species, this deer. Figured we'd throw it up, something different. We've been talking a lot
Yeah.
about corals and turtles and some other things, and then we kind of gave us a big mammal to talk about, which is quite the opposite of your invasive species for the week,
Yeah.
correct?
Yeah. So my
You're most
invasive
wanted.
species is actually the American bullfrog. So the way this is invasive, a little different than others that we've talked about last week. Last few weeks we've talked about species being introduced to the Americas from Asia, the Asian continent, so the other side of the world. Now we're talking of it's a bit more local. So typically, the American bullfrog is native to the eastern and central United States. So kind of that east of the Mississippi sort of area. So a lot more. Uh, a lot of temperate environments, a lot more swampy environments, wetter environments, but it is now crossed the Mississippi and has actually been introduced to the western United States, where it has become an invasive. So we talked about invasive doesn't necessarily have to be a super that comes from somewhere completely different and takes over. But that invasive, we said, is an organism that enters into a new environment and becomes problematic because it outcompetes native species for food, space, and in this case, the American bullfrog is preying on a lot of the native insects that are on the west coast of the United States that it usually doesn't see on the east coast. As well, there's not as many predators for the bullfrog on the west coast because they're not familiar with it. Um, a lot of most likely reason it was introduced is from aquaculture things. So people do eat frog legs. It's typically something you hear a lot in the south, southeastern United States. But as well as the pet trade and used for bait and recreational fishing. So some of those more predatory fish species will eat the bullfrog. Like the eastern United States, like large bass, pike, muskellunge, those predatory fish species will eat it as they're swimming through the water because since they're frogs, they do swim. But now, because of that, pet trade, landscaping, ponds, as well as research and teaching, because this is the frog you most likely is dissected in classrooms when doing frog dissections. This or it's I believe the leopard frog is the other one too, because they're very widespread species.
And similarly sized too. Leopard
Similarly
frogs are
sized, yeah, they're
larger ones.
a larger size. Probably about um, when they're with their legs stretched the whole way out, probably about 1 foot 16 inches, depending on how big of a individual you get. So fairly large frogs, like baseball, softball size. If folks know kind of what those are. But
Yeah, yeah.
because it competes and preys on those native species in the West, it actually has become an invasive species in the Western United States. So it doesn't just have to be a completely exotic organism from an entirely different continent on the other side of the world. It's something that can be relatively close. I mean, of course, the American continent is a big continent, but still, it's not as far away as some of the others that we've talked about. So it's kind of different in that way. So, but that's pretty much all I have for that. For this week, nothing too.
So I have a question for you about that.
Yeah,
So this is are the so it's introduced into the West,
correct.
and anglers use like a frog popper as a bait.
Hmm.
Are the fish able to tell the difference between like the American bullfrog on the West Coast and uh some West Coast frog,
So
or is it just size wise?
it's
You
probably
know,
something just because they're larger,
Mhm.
because they come from wetter environments. There's more food available, more space. But in the West Coast, they're still very hardy animals.
Right.
They can live outside of water for fairly long periods of time. So it's something because they're probably a lot larger than many of the native West Coast frogs are. That's why they're able to
The
survive.
the predatory fish kind of keep off them because
Yeah, they're
they're
probably not as familiar with them. A lot of frogs in the United States are similar. They're not all the same. Like they kind of have a brownish, like a brownish green color to them, but then their belly is like a white color,
right.
cream white color. But it's not all. Some are much more brown. Like the wood frog is totally brown on its uh, upper side,
Yeah.
because it lives more in in forested areas, kind of hopping between different like vernal pools and some streams. They're not quite as aquatic as the bullfrog is. So I think a lot of it has to do with the size of
Okay.
the frogs in relation to the natives.
Understood. So that's gonna wrap up our discussions for the day. We will, go into our housekeeping that we normally finish our episodes with. As always, make sure you like and subscribe on YouTube. Give us a follow on Spotify if you haven't already. Those numbers really help us out as we try to expand our sphere and spread the word of taxonomy and nature to everybody. Because as we finish our tree, we have thousands of other topics we can talk about besides phylogeny and taxonomy. Um,
Absolutely that. And if there's anything that the listeners find that they find super interesting, want us to talk more about, have questions for us, um, I would be more than happy to do our best to answer some of those questions, kind of teach everyone, as well as ourselves. We learn a lot as we go through this as well. We'd love to learn from you guys.
right. And if you want to email us, Alex, what is that email?
It is lifecompletestory@gmail.com.
Thank
So
you.
there's no the in the email.
Yeah, it's
Uh,
just lifecompletstory@gmail.com.
all one big word. I think all lowercase letters.
Yes. Update for everybody involved. We have our social media pages up. We have an
Yes, we
Instagram.
do. Thank to Tyler, a champion.
We have our Instagram. You can follow us at Life Complete Story on Instagram. And we have a Facebook page, Life the Complete Story on Facebook. Uh, I will be posting, Alex might be posting if he gets the time to, uh, articles we run across throughout the week as we're planning and prepping for our recording session, as well as maybe an amazing species that one of us hears about throughout the week or just feels like popping on the IUCN list and giving a speech about, or some really annoying little critter that is not from around our neck of the woods that we just feel like ranting about,
Or
like
just
spotted lanternflies.
yes, or just something really cool we find.
Yeah, or
Some
yeah,
interesting thing. Just today, um, social media is a great thing. Just today, I found a video of someone describing a couple arthropods. We haven't gotten there yet. That
yeah, we
and
saw very interesting videos
yeah,
on
how
about
organisms go through. They'll mimic other organisms. So the one we saw today was a spider that was actually mimicking an ant. Very interesting. Very
and there
cool.
was another spider in that same video that mimicked a mantis species,
I think it was a
correct?
fly. I think it was a lacewing
It
fly.
was a lacewing that mimicked
It looked
a mantis.
both like a wasp, but also a mantis at the same time. Very interesting species.
Very
Stuff.
terrifying.
Yeah, it
Very
was crazy
terrifying.
looking. Stuff like this is stuff we'd love to share. that you guys submit to us. We would love to
Right.
share this with everyone else that
Yeah,
listens.
it'd be fantastic for us to have a little segment at the end where we highlight user submissions, whether it be an article you find, something you see on Instagram Reels. Maybe it's a, I've seen a lot of people do like a what is this, and they'll send you like a weird video where it's like, what is this animal? Typically an arthropod.
Yeah,
Um,
something
that's going to
crazy.
wrap it up for this week, guys. As always, I'm your host, Tyler, along with my lovely co host, Alex. We will see you all next week
Yeah,
for our talk on nematoda. And always, keep learning.
learn something new every day.